We're looking at this idea of attacking out of mounted position through a systematic 4-step process. I don't care how good you get at a given system, at some point you're going to experience failure. And that failure can occur at any point in the process. We have a 4-step system. It's based around the idea of first, getting to an underhook. Second, separating your opponent's elbow away from his torso and bringing it above the shoulder line. Third, getting to a control grip where your opponent simply can't escape and he's extremely vulnerable to attack because he's extended into a position of weakness. So for example, single arm wrap, double arm wrap, basic arm wraps, etc., etc. And then going into the fourth and final step, which is to actually submit them using one of 4 methodologies. Okay, we favor karagatame as the initial attack. We favor rear strangles. If we can't get to the karagatame, we create a dilemma between the front strangle and the back strangle. And judigatame, the armbar, and the mounted triangle. So those are the 4 methods of attack that we favor above all others. Now, a natural question for you guys to be asking is, okay, that's cool, nice system, I enjoyed watching that. What if I can't get it to work? Okay, let's understand one of the most common points of failure is the first part of the system, which is getting to an underhook and walking my opponent's arm up. So when you get into the second phase, you just can't, you can get the underhook, but you just can't walk his arm up above the shoulder line. The number one reason why this happens is because your opponent is a lot stronger than you are, which happens a lot. Okay. We're here mounted on a training partner, and we've done a good job of pushing his arm down and getting tricep exposure so I can get the underhook in place. We even did a good job of going through and getting to the collar grip and lifting and getting into the crossface. But when it's time to walk his arm up, this guy is strong, strong, strong. And you're trying to walk the hand up and it's just not happening. Then he starts threatening to pull your arm in. You're like, oh my God, this guy's way stronger than me. If I stay mounted and he brings my elbow to his side, he can take me over and roll up on top. So our first thing when we feel we're losing the battle and we cannot get his arm up is to put my head on the floor so that if Placido went to bridge me over, my head would be a base of support. If he went to elbow escape on that side, it would actually be pretty difficult because I'm controlling his elbow. Okay, so he can't bridge because of my head base, and he can't do a left elbow escape because I'm controlling his arm. But on the other hand, I can't get his arm up above the shoulder line either. So what do? Under these circumstances, we're going to plant our knee and bring our foot to our buttocks, and we're going to pommel our foot to the other side, and we're going to come out side control. I'm going to take my cross face out, and we're going to put our hand on the mat. I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to hug his shoulder. And I'm going to take my elbow, and I'm going to put it on his sternum, and I'm going to put my shoulder above his elbow. And then from here, I'm going to take my knees off the floor and touch my ear to his hip, and I'm going to go into a tripod over his head. If he tries to pull his arm out,
impossible.
Good luck. It's fucking tough. I take my knee and I touch the back of his head. I take my other knee, I put it on his face, and I make him look downwards. And then I just sit down on his head. So the Placido goes to move his head around, it's not going anywhere. We've got him locked in place, and my second arm threads through. And I hug his arm. I hug my own elbow, and I have my hand, the back of my hand on his forearm. So when Placido goes to move around, he's controlled at the head and the shoulder. And from this situation, we get a hold of the figure 4 lock. I bring everything up north. I take his hand in one direction, that's a misdirection, and then I take it rapidly across in the other. And from this position, I put his hand behind his back, I unlock my legs, and I go into a wide sprawl and arch my back. My elbow comes to Placido's elbow, tap, 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 and we look out and away, and you get a truly savage Kimura lock, okay? So once again, we're mounted. And we've got a guy who knows that we like a 4-step system from mount. He's been scouting us, and he's like, yeah, I know what these guys do. They get a hold of an underhook, then they try to walk the arm over the head, then they get these damn control grips, and then they go into these 4 submission holds, okay? Well, let me stop them as early as possible. So it's pretty hard to stop someone from just getting an underhook. That's pretty hard to stop. it's pretty hard to stop someone getting here. But if he marshals all his resources and keeps his arm close to his side, it can be pretty damn tough on a strong guy to walk his arm up north. Okay? Now, my biggest concern is he sucks my arm in, and then from here he bridges me over. Okay? It's hard for him to elbow escape on the left side because I control his elbow. So that's not really a realistic option. If he goes to kip, it's tough because my body's kind of corkscrewed over. Okay? But bridging, that's an option he could take. So that's my first concern. So I put my head on the floor. So when he goes to bridge, my head is a base of support. Now from here, I put my knee on the floor and I pommel my foot across to the other side. And I walk out. I put my hand down on the mat, ear close to his bicep. When he goes to pull his left arm out, when he goes to turn to the left, it's tough. If I went here and he turned hard left, he'll take me out of balance. So we come in here. Now I scoop up and I take my elbow to his sternum so I can use my head to control his elbow. I come up into a tripod to put weight over him. Then I use my knee to capture his head. And I use my other knee to make him look down to the floor. Then I bring him up. And from here I go through and I hold. I take my arm free and I lock the figure of 4. I bring everything up north. I misdirect one way. And then I quickly take the hand, boom, back the other. I put it behind his back. I switch my base. I step forward, step over the head, and then from here I bring everything forward. I sweep my elbow to his elbow, tap, and there's your finish. Okay? So that's how we deal with a situation where you cannot walk the arm northward. We take the underhook and we dismount to the opposite side. As a result, you have a full range of great submissions. I'm demonstrating Kimura, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out there's a whole bunch of other great options there, okay? So once we get up into a position like so, if I feel we're in here and I cannot separate his hands, okay? He's got very, very strong hands and I just can't separate. And from here, I just put my hand on his back. So I take my Kimura and I slide everything over and I put my hand on his back. Then from here, I just step my leg right over the top. And I use my legs now to control his wrist. My hand goes onto my training partner and I switch my hips all the way across to his hips. So, and then from here, you've got a very, very strong legs Kimura. There's a very talented young fellow from, I believe it's Denmark, who one of the Nordic countries.
Tariq.
Yeah, he's a nice kid. He uses this a lot and he's very famous for it these days. But using the legs to enact Kimura is a great option whenever you can't separate your training partner's hands. So once again,
And Zenga almost broke my shoulder once.
no way.
Tariq
Really?
Yeah, on these mats.
And they
Well, so
think I'm
Tariq was
Russian.
here teaching Zenga the Tarico Plata, and Zenga puts me a Tarico Plata on my right shoulder. And he literally dropped his weight into the Tarico Plata. And Zenga has been many times compared to a walrus. I think for many obvious reasons that we will leave unnamed. But, dude, I scream tapped at the top of my lungs. And to this day, the shoulder does not have the mobility that my left shoulder has. To this day.
Greatest thing I ever heard. I must give Zinger buy him a beer for doing that to you. So anytime, lock up, buddy. Anytime we have that control over our training partner and we've done a good job of putting his head down to the mat, if I can separate the hands, great. I'll put the hand behind the back and use the hands to enact the Kimura, a hands Kimura, okay? But if I cannot separate the hands, then we've got to use our legs. So I take my hands and I slide them over and I put my hand on his back, just like so. That stabilizes his wrist. He tries to move his wrist now, and it's caught between that mini figure 4 that I have. If I just try to have my hands like so, the hand can move around. It's a moving target. So I want to weld everything onto his back. And that makes it my step over guaranteed. Now I just grab my own thigh. Now fellas, don't finish from wherever you are. Take your tailbone and walk it to his hip. So I bring my foot in and I walk my tailbone around the corner to his hip. you should see my tailbone on his right hip, so that when I use my leg, tap, you get a quick break, okay? Don't break with your tailbone on his belly button. Bring your tailbone right to his hip, okay? And that's when your legs can come in and form a devastating lock. Obviously, there's a ton of other moves from the same position. All kinds of triangles. If I see any kind of space, let's face this way. We'll be covering these kinds of things when we go over the side position. If there's any kind of space here, you can step into that space, rake it back, and find all kinds of triangle attacks from this position. You can put a knee over your training partner's bicep to make it harder for him to prevent the breaking apart of the hands. You, of course, can go into Judigatami on the opposite side, sitting back, finding yourself in the perfect attacking position from here. And of course, once you get into a basic position, you've got the whole Judy series that we looked at previously. So, word to the wise. Anytime you cannot walk the arm overhead from the mounted position, our response to that form of failure, dismount. Dismount to the opposite side and then go around and pinch your opponent's head between your knees and go into your kimuras, hand kimuras, legs kimuras, Judigatami, variations of the triangle, and use those as your primary forms of attack. That way you can overcome failure at that initial step when it's time to try and walk your opponent's elbow over the top of the shoulder line. We're looking at this idea that any system can fail, and it can fail at any step as the system progresses. We looked at a situation in the previous move where the second step of our 4-step system failed. You got an underhook, but you just couldn't walk his arm up. He's just too strong for you. And we saw the idea of dismounting and continuing an attack from the side position. Now, an obvious question for us to be asking here is, okay, well, what if I fail at the very first step? Well, what if I just can't even get an underhook? This guy knows what I'm trying to do, and he's just like this. And I can't get his elbows away from the side. I tried everything. I just can't get an underhook. I can't even get the 4-step system started. It's just a complete non-starter. What do I do now? Okay. In these situations, I always encourage people, sit back into the legs. Okay. Go for your leg locks. So let's say we're mounted on this guy. Yes, sir. And you know what? Let's see. Initially, we'll go on this side. Okay, we've got a guy who's just ultra disciplined with his elbow position, and he might even be playing kind of a stalling game. He's just like, you might have gotten mounted on me, but you're not going to finish me. You're not going to get up into those positions where you're going to get mounted triangles or arm bars and any of that nonsense. I'm just going to hold my elbows in close. And then he starts digging to get inside position on your elbows, and you're like, dude, I'm never going to get this, short, strong limbs, and his hands are locked, and you're like, oh, dude, I'm never going to get underhook on this guy. What do I do? Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to give him an elbow escape. So let's say he goes right elbow escape. I'm going to give a little lift. Slow down, buddy. Slow down. I'm going to give a little lift with my foot. So he's like, holy shit, there's an open door there. And he goes and he captures my ankle. Then from here, I'm going to walk back in the opposite direction. And I'm going to come up and take my knee from one hip across to the other. Now, at this point, he could start thinking about getting underhooks on you. Okay, he could go right arm underhook, for example. Okay, so we're going to start posting our hands in his armpit. So even if he did go for an underhook, he couldn't use it because I have a post that doesn't give him what he really wants, which is bicep contact. That's when the underhook is useful. So we're going to post here and here. Okay, he goes to use his underhook, and I just post out like so. I just sit on my training partner's hips. Then in one motion, my hand comes down to the mat, and we just back step right into our training partner's legs. From here, I gather up my training partner's opposite ankle and lock it. You have two choices now. You can use a sit back, like so, or you can use a roll forward, where I tuck my shoulder and roll forward. I leave that up to you. They're both good options, okay? So once again, we've got a knowledgeable opponent in the bottom position. And this guy isn't going to give anything up for free, So as he's in here, he's disciplined, and we're trying to get underhooks and just nothing is happening. Then 2-3 minutes has gone by and we haven't even got close to an underhook. Okay? So now I'm just going to lift my foot just a little and give him an elbow escape on that side. So he's thinking to himself, oh, I got the foot. Great. He's going to want to put my knee between his legs now. So as he goes to try, I'm just going to take my knee to his belly button. I'm going to start that action of walking across his body, just like so. If I feel him reaching for an underhook, I'll come in here and post it. Okay? Until we're in a situation where I can backstep into his legs. Now, I could go straight for this ankle, especially if he was naive like this. But presumably he's going to be disciplined with his leg position. Maybe he knows you're a fan of leg locks or what have you. Now we're going to bring our hand here to the knee tendon and my second hand here. So that when I sit back, I get a good opportunity to lace his ankles. Okay? Now what do you think your opponent's going to want to do at this point? Okay? Right now he can't do much sitting up there. There's not a lot he can do just from here. Okay? But at some point, I've got to let go of this secondary leg so I can heel hook the primary leg. So here, we're going to punch our hand through and lock up. I'm going to take my hand across, spear it in, and get to a good grip on my training partner. At this point, you can fully expect your opponent to start turning his foot defensively. Okay? So it's up to us to start lifting our opponent this way to expose his heel. And as a result, pretty easy for us to go through and lock. Okay? Now as he comes back in that defensive position we just saw, I put my foot all the way through and down, and we're in a very, very fine attacking position. Okay, we've got the shoelace senkaku, where my senkaku is locked right on the inside. So if he tried to scoot backwards, very, very difficult. If he goes to turn in this direction, he'll shred his own knee. If he goes to fight my hands, difficult because he's got a big barrier in front of him. Then from here, close up our grip and we get a very strong break. So once again, we're in a mounted position and we just can't get anything going on. The whole first step of the system is just not there for us. No underhook, and it's been, time has gone by. You've given an honest try. You can just quit in the first 10 seconds, but you've been here 3-4 minutes and just no forward progress. And you feel like this guy's eventually got to get inside my knees and start escaping. Okay? So from here, I give him a little bit of a gift, and he starts to work his way out. From here, I deny the knee by putting it up on his belly button and walking across to the opposite side. From situations like this, we just backstep right into the legs. I capture the knee tendon all the way in. I capture the ankle and we sit back. And as a result, we can punch into a good hold. Now, from here, so many ways for us to go. Not one good solid one to work with is to get his feet separated one from the other. He tries to bring his feet back together. It's not going to happen. From here, many ways for us to go in on the attack. Okay, one good way is for us to turn him to expose his heel. Now from here, off that initial heel exposure, we go through and lock. Now I lock the figure of 4 and I take my shoelaces all the way through underneath, not on his back, underneath at the hip, so that when I return him to the mat, I now have my feet on the outside and my senkaku on the inside. When he tries to drag away from us, so difficult. He tries to punch in towards us, so difficult. Then we switch our hand grip. Initially you're loose, and then you're up here and tight. And as a result, very, very strong breaking pressure. Okay? So that's an excellent way to sit back into the legs. Let's look at some alternatives now. Head this way, buddy. Okay. This time, he goes hunting for that foot. From here, we move down the body. We put the knee on the belly button, and we walk across. We backstep into our training partner's legs. We pick our training partner's leg up, and from this position, we roll on through. Because we rolled through, we have some heel exposure to work with here. So I punch, bring my legs through like so. Now from here, I just give a little push with my legs and take this foot out of my armpit. Now, this is a decent position, But if Placido has skills, he's going to tripod and push back into me and kill my heel hook. So if we finish in this position, I see him tripod, it's important that I take my foot through into a crisscross ashi. So now when he tries to push into me, I can put pressure on the back of his knee and I win the pushing contest. And from here, so many ways for us to go to create strong breaking pressure. So once again,
I'll facing that way.
From here, I go right elbow escape for Placido. I go across left. I backstep into my training partner's legs. I capture the knee tendon and the ankle. Previously, we fell backwards. This time, we roll forwards. From here, look how I bring my hand between his ankles and I lock on the exposed heel. I push forward with my knees, take his second leg out. If my foot stays on his back, he can kill my heel hook because I have no ability to push back into him. So when I see him tripod, it's important that I take my foot through and lock in front of his thigh. Now I can push on the back of his knee. So as Placido tries to bulldoze me back, I put him down to the floor. And from here, we get very strong breaks for the finish. So there's some common sense ways for us to sit back into our training partner's legs. If we can't get the underhook started and failure, we've given it an honest try. Don't just quit on the first attempt. You've been there 2-3 minutes and you just can't get that underhook in place, then it's time to start looking for other options. And one great option when you can't get an underhook is to step back into your opponent's legs. We just saw some practical ways to go into a very controlling form of an inside heel hook and working out of double trouble and exposing the heel for quick finishes on the legs when you can't go upstairs for the upper body. Now, we've been through an awful lot together on this video in terms of giving you a deep understanding of the mounted position as practiced by my students. I want now to give you a final overview of this 4x4 mount system and a kind of overall summary of all the things we've been through in a way which will refresh your memory and make it easier for you to remember the broad picture, the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish next time you're out on the mats and improving your performance as a result. Okay, Placido, you're down, champ. Now, let's understand first, what is the problem which we're trying to solve here? The problem is that in submission grappling, you're not allowed to punch people. And as a result, the way the mounted position normally works in terms of putting pressure on people by punching them and elbowing them in the face, and as you get defensive reactions, you go into submission holds. All that goes out the window in submission grappling. Most of your opponents will keep a disciplined defensive position where their elbows are very close to their sides. And as a result, it won't be easy to get submission holds on them. We've seen that the 4x4 system has 3 critical insights and goals that it's designed to work with. The first is the notion of elbow penetration. The idea is that I want to be able to penetrate underneath an opponent's elbow and put my wrist and forearm between his elbow and his ribs. All of his defense comes out of the fact that he has defensively sound positioning of his elbows. His elbows by his sides mean that he can bridge and roll, he can go into elbow escapes, he can kip escape, he can do all these kinds of things. So our whole thing is to put a barrier between his elbows and his own ribs. Okay, so that's the idea of elbow penetration. Once we've penetrated the elbow, then the next thing is elbow separation, where we take his elbow out into vulnerable positions. And the most vulnerable from the mount is where the elbow goes over the shoulder line and starts to expose the triceps. Okay, if we can do this with one or both of our opponent's arms, that's a wonderful thing. In addition, there is a third step where we go beyond the idea of simply penetrating the elbow and separating the elbow, but rather holding an opponent in what we call a control grip, where we lock onto an opponent and put them into situations where the arm is locked up overhead, sometimes 1, sometimes 2, and we have total control of our opponent's head and shoulders working from these positions. You've exposed your training partner's triceps, and as a result, submission holds are going to be easy. Now, in practice, all this works into 4 concrete steps. Okay. Step number 1 means we have to be able to establish an underhook. We saw that there are various means whereby we can expose our training partner's elbows and get those elbows away from the torso. If we can do so and get a hold of the underhook and the head, this is our starting position. Everything starts from here. Okay. Now, we saw a bunch of ways to do this, but the one we use most of the time involves some kind of cross wrist grab, so that as a result, we can take his hand out of a good defensive position and start to expose the tricep like so. Okay. Once we get down to here and we've got that underhook in place, now the combination of crossface and underhook enables us to go into step 2, which is to take our training partner's elbow up above the shoulder line. The method we use to get this done is the ratchet method, where our arm comes out wide and we play between our elbow on the floor and the elbow elevated down, taking our head over his head to move his elbow and snatch progressively more space until we can get his elbow up on our shoulder. As long as his elbow is down on my elbow, he can pull my arm in and cause problems. So when he goes to pull the arm in, we're always looking to get our elbow up off the mat and walk out wide, like so. Every time we need a break, we'll put our elbow down on the floor and then progressively work the elbow up above the shoulder line until we can get a hold of our training partner's head. Once we can get a hold of the head, then we start the action of lifting the head and getting a hold of our own elbow in place, okay? And now we're into the first of the control grips. From these various control grips, and we looked at 4 of them. The first is the so-called single chest wrap, where I have one arm and I'm wrapped around my opponent's head and his head is in my chest. This creates a severe asphyxiation threat. As my opponent tries to breathe, we work further and further forward and interrupt our training partner's breathing. So as he tries to hold himself from here, it won't be easy. And as we put more and more pressure on his breathing, we get stronger and stronger panic reactions. Now, most of the time, we're looking to get his hand in front of us by shoulder shrugging. But there's going to be times you can't do that, in which case we will switch to another form of grip, the underhook with the far trap muscle. So when Placido tries to hold his arm behind my back, you can put so much pressure on the arm here, there's just no chance. This feeds in very organically to the third of the control grips, which is an arm wrap, where my opponent's arm gets wrapped around his own head, just like so. Another version of this, slightly stronger, is the figure 4 arm wrap, okay, where we can really put some powerful mechanical control over an opponent. In addition, if I see my opponent's opposite arm is exposed, we may well go into, using that same ratchet method on the second arm, the double chest wrap, where both arms are taken over the head, just like so. And we get a hold of our training partner's, of our own tricep, like so. He tries to hold us off, and now both arms are controlled. Okay? So everything begins with penetration of the elbow, courtesy of an underhook. Once we have underhook and crossface, we start elbow separation, using the ratchet method, our opponent's arm overhead, and then going into the various control grips. Each one of those control grips is correlated with 4 submission holds that we use from the mounted position. These are katagatame, jujigatame, the triangle, and strangles from the back. These are the 4 most high percentage methods of finishing. In general, not always, but in general, we start with katagatame because it's the most conservative one. It takes the least risk. And then we use the other 3 as we see fit. Now, as an opponent works down in these positions, you're going to find that each one of the various control grips is well correlated with a given submission. Okay, so single chest wrap is generally correlated with katagatame. Single chest wrap is often correlated with triangles because we can get an opponent's body well isolated here with just the head and the arm together. And as a result, it's relatively easy for us now to start turning forward and going into various forms of triangle attack. You will generally find that double chest wraps are best correlated with Jujigatami, as both arms are now caught in situations where it's very, very hard for an opponent to prevent the various forms of attack from Jujigatami. And you will generally find that rear strangles are typically correlated with the far trap underhook. Why? Because as an opponent makes himself strong and resistant, this enables us to turn people in a given direction and make switches into various forms of arm wrap, which enable us to lift the opponent's head off the floor and get into attacking angles when we can expose our training partner's back and get to those rear strangles that we favor so much. So we have the 4x4 system, in which step number 1 is always bound up with the idea of penetrating your opponent's elbow. The number 1 method of doing so is the underhook, and we saw a bunch of effective ways to do this. Step number 2 is elbow separation, taking the elbow up above the shoulder line, and the method we use is the ratchet method. Step number 3 is to impose a control grip on our opponent. This has 3 effects. The first is to interfere with your opponent's breathing and put their focus entirely upon getting their next breath rather than defending themselves. It also does a great job of shutting down your opponent's main avenues of defense, shuts down the elbow escape, shuts down the kipping escape, shuts down the bridging escapes. And it keeps your opponent's arm and head isolated in a way which sets up the 4 submission holds that we face. Once we've employed those 3 steps, then it's time to finish. We have 4 major forms of submission that we use: Karagatame, Jujigatame, triangle, and strangles from the rear. The only thing that remains to be said is if we cannot impose the system, okay, you just can't get it done, then we have fallback options. So if I'm on top of Placido, and for whatever reason, I am completely unable to get to an underhook, I just can't do it for whatever reason, it's just not there. Then under situations like that, I may well offer a foot to him and give him the beginnings of an elbow escape. And we saw once we've done that, it's not so hard for us to start turning across our training partner and backstepping into our training partner's legs. Once we get a hold of our training partner's legs, then we can go down to lower body attacks, which we looked at. If, on the other hand, I can get an underhook, but I cannot get my opponent's arm all the way up over his shoulder line. I can't separate the elbow. I've penetrated the elbow with an underhook, but I can't separate it. Under these circumstances, we generally favor the idea of dismounting. And from the dismount, getting ourselves into a position where we trap our training partner's head and go into fine attacking positions like so. And from positions like this, very often we can go into various forms of attack out of side control. So those are your 2 fallback options. If you can't impose the system, if you can't get to your underhook, or you can't bring your opponent's elbow up above the shoulder line, those are your fallback options. So there you have it. A quick and easy understanding of the general pattern that we use. You can see that it's a very simple system. There are only 4 families of submission holds within it. And the 4 steps are very easy to remember under stress. Practice those. It will give you a sense of direction from the mounted position that will make you a very difficult opponent to beat. We've come to the conclusion of this video on mounted pins and attacks from there. You've seen my students use them very successfully in competition. I want to leave you all now, not with a technique, but with an insight that will change the way you view pinning in the sport of jiu-jitsu. The first day you joined your jiu-jitsu school and began the study of the art, you were probably told, position first, submission second. Now, to a beginner starting out in the sport, that's some wonderful advice. even for an expert, it's still good advice. But as I'm sure you're starting to figure out from watching this video, in the context of submission grappling, it's not enough. Understand that position before submission makes perfect sense if you look at jiu-jitsu within the realm of self-defense and fighting. If I'm mounted on an opponent and I get to a position, like in this case, the mounted position, the position itself is enough for me to win. Because the assumption is in a fight, I will be striking an opponent and working with strikes. And this will create openings for submission, or the strikes themselves may be enough to finish the fight. The problem is you guys aren't fighting. You're engaged in submission grappling. And without strikes, the position itself isn't enough. Because your opponent will be in sound defensive positions with his elbows in a very tight defensive position by his sides. That means every time he turns to an angle, he gets inside position. And as a result, elbow escapes become easy. If I try to get inside his arms, he can overwrap my arm and then take me over. He can keep inside elbow position and form frames where he can start kipping and then eventually escape. So what you find in submission grappling without strikes, the position itself isn't enough. You have to go the extra distance. You can't just say position before submission anymore in a world without strikes. You have to add a bridge between the position and the submission. And that bridge is a control grip. The idea is that if I can break my opponent's posture and get an arm, elbow far away from the torso and up over the shoulder line into vulnerable positions and start working on my training partner's ability to breathe, from here, now they're going to be vulnerable to submission. It's from situations like this that we can start working our body up and turning and going into various forms of angle, where from here, submission starts happening very, very easily. There's a sense here in which you have to change your outlook about pinning in submission grappling. It's not enough just to say, I've got the position, the submission will follow. That might be true with punches and elbows. It's not true if you have a disciplined, knowledgeable opponent who knows how to maintain good defensive structure and can work his escapes. You have to go the extra distance from your pins and get people up into extended, vulnerable positions and use control grips to hold them in place. In the case of the mounted position, we've shown you exactly how to do this and how to use 4 different control grips to go into 4 different submissions. So now, instead of saying the simple old cliche, position before submission, now you need to start thinking in terms of, yes, position first, but don't go directly from position to submission. Add in the intermediary approach of breaking your opponent's defensive posture. His ideal defensive posture in the bottom of pins will always be the integrity of his elbows close to his sides. Ultimately, it may form some kind of escape which brings knee and elbow integrity, but it begins with the positioning of his elbows. And so once you get to the given position, your next step is not submission. Your next step is to break the integrity of his defensive position and get elbows into vulnerable positions away from the body. So instead of just mouthing the old cliche, position before submission, now think in terms of position first. Second, break your opponent's defensive posture. Get the elbows up and away and hold them and control them for periods of time. Only then do you make the transition into submission. Instead of being a 2-step system, position, submission, now you need this idea of position, breaking your opponent's defensive stance, and then submission. A 3-step process instead of a 2-step process. This is made necessary by the fact that you're not allowed to punch or elbow in the context of submission grappling. And so the old cliche of position first, submission second needs to be replaced by position first, breaking your opponent's defensive structure second, and then submission. If you think in those terms, I promise you, you will develop from being an athlete who can get a position to become an athlete who can get a position and then reliably submit people from that position.